Imagine sitting in a courtroom, the air thick with tension as a judge, a figure meant to embody fairness and justice, looks down at a black man standing before her and delivers a remark so racially charged, so blatantly disrespectful, that the entire room falls silent. You could hear a pin drop. This wasn't just an insult. It was a moment that exposed the deep-seated biases that still linger in places where they should never exist. But what happened next? Well, that's where the story takes a turn no one saw coming. 7 minutes later, the same judge who thought she was untouchable found herself staring at the flashing lights of a police car, and the man she had just insulted was the one holding the handcuffs. How did the tables turn so dramatically? Who was this man, and what led to this jaw-dropping moment of poetic justice? This is a story about power, prejudice, and the unexpected twists that can happen when the system is forced to confront its own flaws. The courtroom was packed that day, a mix of curious onlookers, lawyers, and defendants waiting for their cases to be called. At the center of it all was Judge Margaret Hayes, a woman known for her no-nonsense demeanor and sharp tongue. She had a reputation for being tough, but also for crossing lines that made people uncomfortable. On the other side of the room stood Marcus Johnson, a 34-year-old mechanic and father of two, who had been called to court over a minor traffic violation. Marcus wasn't a stranger to the system, but he had always tried to keep his head down and do the right thing. He never expected that this routine appearance would turn into something so much bigger. As Marcus stepped forward to address the judge, he could feel the weight of her gaze. It wasn't just scrutiny. It was something else, something that made his skin crawl. When he tried to explain his side of the story, Judge Hayes cut him off with a wave of her hand. "You people always have an excuse," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. The words hung in the air like a dark cloud. Marcus froze, his heart pounding. Did she really just say that? The room erupted in murmurs, but no one dared to speak up. Marcus, however, wasn't about to let it slide. "Excuse me, Your Honor," he said, his voice steady but firm. But that comment was out of line. The judge's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, it seemed like she might retaliate. But then something unexpected happened. 7 minutes later, the doors of the courtroom swung open and in walked 2 police officers. But they weren't there for Marcus. They walked straight up to the bench, and one of them spoke quietly to the judge. Her face turned pale as she listened, her confident demeanor crumbling in an instant. The officers stepped back, and Marcus, who had been standing quietly in the corner, stepped forward. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a badge. The room gasped. Marcus wasn't just a mechanic. He was also an undercover federal agent, working on a long-term investigation into corruption within the local justice system. And Judge Hayes? She had just become his latest target. As the officers led her away in handcuffs, Marcus stood tall, his expression unreadable. The courtroom was in chaos, people whispering, some even recording the scene on their phones. But Marcus didn't say a word. He just watched as the judge who had insulted him was escorted out of the room, her head bowed in shame. It was a moment of vindication, but it was also just the beginning. What had Marcus uncovered during his investigation? How deep did the corruption go? And what would happen next, now that the truth was starting to come to light? The answers to those questions would shake the entire community to its core. But that's a story for another time. For now, all anyone could do was watch in stunned silence as the wheels of justice began to turn in a way no one had anticipated. The arrest of Judge Margaret Hayes sent shockwaves through the courthouse, but for Marcus Johnson, it was just the tip of the iceberg. For months he had been working undercover, posing as an ordinary citizen while quietly gathering evidence of corruption, bias, and abuse of power within the local justice system. It wasn't just about traffic violations or petty crimes. It was about something much bigger, something that had been festering beneath the surface for years. And Judge Hayes? She was just one piece of the puzzle. Marcus had known going into this assignment that it would be dangerous, but he hadn't expected it to get personal. That comment in the courtroom, though, it had struck a nerve. It wasn't just about him. It was about every person who had ever walked into that courthouse and felt like they weren't being treated fairly because of the color of their skin. Now, with the judge in custody, Marcus knew the real work was just beginning. To understand how Marcus ended up in that courtroom, you have to go back to the beginning. Marcus had grown up in the same city where he now worked as an undercover agent. He knew the streets, the people, and the struggles they faced. He had seen firsthand how the system could fail those it was supposed to protect, and it had always bothered him. After high school, he joined the military, where he learned discipline, strategy, and the importance of standing up for what's right. When he returned home, he decided to put those skills to use in law enforcement. But it wasn't long before he realized that the problems he wanted to solve ran deeper than he had imagined. That's when he was approached by a federal task force, looking for someone with his background, someone who could blend in, gain trust, and uncover the truth without drawing attention. Marcus was perfect for the job, and he didn't hesitate to accept. The investigation had started small, focusing on a few low-level officials who were suspected of taking bribes. But as Marcus dug deeper, he began to uncover a web of corruption that reached far beyond what anyone had anticipated. Judges, lawyers, even police officers, all of them were connected in ways that made Marcus's stomach turn. It wasn't just about money, it was about power. And at the center of it all was Judge Hayes. She wasn't just a racist with a bad attitude. She was a key player in a system that had been rigged to keep certain people down. Marcus had spent months gathering evidence, recording conversations, and building a case that would hold up in court. But he knew that taking her down wouldn't be easy. She was well-connected, respected, at least on the surface, and had a reputation for being untouchable. That's why he had to be careful. One wrong move, and the whole operation could fall apart. The day of the courtroom incident had started like any other. Marcus had been following a lead that pointed to a meeting between Judge Hayes and a local businessman who was suspected of bribing officials to get favorable rulings. Marcus had planned to observe from a distance, but when he got a call about a minor traffic violation that required his appearance in court, he saw an opportunity. He knew Judge Hayes would be presiding, and he wanted to see her in action. What he hadn't expected was the blatant racism she displayed. That comment, the one about "you people," wasn't just offensive. It was a window into her true character, and it gave Marcus the leverage he needed to move forward with the arrest. But as satisfying as it was to see her taken away in handcuffs, Marcus knew it wasn't over. In fact, it was just the beginning. As the news of Judge Hayes's arrest spread, the city was divided. Some people celebrated, calling it a long overdue victory for justice. Others were skeptical, wondering if there was more to the story. And then there were those who were angry, people who had benefited from the judge's corruption and were now scrambling to cover their tracks. Marcus knew he had to be careful. He had made a lot of enemies, and not all of them were behind bars. But he also knew he couldn't back down. The evidence he had collected pointed to a much larger conspiracy, one that involved some of the most powerful people in the city. If he could bring them down, it would be a game changer, but it wouldn't be easy. In the days following the arrest, Marcus found himself under increasing pressure. Anonymous threats started coming in, phone calls in the middle of the night, notes left on his car, even a break-in at his apartment. It was clear that someone wanted him to stop digging. But Marcus wasn't the type to be intimidated. If anything, the threats only made him more determined. He knew he was close to uncovering the truth, and he wasn't about to let anyone stand in his way. But as he continued to follow the trail, he began to realize just how deep the corruption went. It wasn't just about bribes or biased rulings. It was about a system that had been designed to keep certain people in power and others out. And Judge Hayes was just one piece of the puzzle. One of the most shocking discoveries Marcus made was the existence of a secret network of judges, lawyers, and law enforcement officials who had been working together to manipulate cases for their own benefit. They called themselves the Circle, and they operated in the shadows, using coded language and encrypted messages to communicate. Marcus had managed to intercept some of their communications, but decoding them was a challenge. He knew that if he could crack the code, he would have the evidence he needed to bring down the entire network. But time was running out. The more he uncovered, the more dangerous it became. And with every step he took, he could feel the walls closing in. Meanwhile, Judge Hayes was fighting back. From her jail cell, she was using every connection she had to try to discredit Marcus and the investigation. She claimed that the arrest was a setup, that Marcus had fabricated evidence to frame her. And some people believed her. After all, she had been a judge for over 20 years. Why would she risk everything now? Marcus knew he had to stay one step ahead. He had the evidence, but he needed to make sure it was airtight. One mistake, and the whole case could fall apart. And if that happened, not only would the corrupt officials walk free, but Marcus's life would be in even greater danger. As the tension mounted, Marcus found himself thinking about his family. His wife Lisa had always supported him, but she was worried. She had seen the toll the investigation was taking on him, and she knew the risks he was facing. Their 2 kids, just 8 and 10 years old, didn't understand why their dad was working so much or why he seemed so stressed all the time. Marcus hated keeping them in the dark, but he knew it was for their own safety. The less they knew, the better. Still, it weighed on him. He had always believed in doing the right thing, but now he was starting to wonder if the cost was too high. The breaking point came one night when Marcus received a call from an anonymous tipster. The voice on the other end was shaky, almost scared. "You're in over your head," the person said. "If you keep digging, you're going to find something you can't handle." Marcus tried to press for more information, but the line went dead. He didn't know who the tipster was, or what they were trying to warn him about, but he had a sinking feeling that things were about to get a lot worse. The next morning, he received a package in the mail. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a message written in bold letters: "Back off, or else." There was no return address, no signature, just those 4 words. Marcus knew it was a threat, but he also knew he couldn't back down. He was too close to the truth. As he sat in his office staring at the message, Marcus's mind raced. Who had sent it? Was it someone from the circle, trying to scare him off? Or was it someone else entirely? He didn't have the answers, but he knew one thing for sure: the stakes had just gotten higher. The investigation was no longer just about exposing corruption. It was about survival. Marcus had always known this job would come with risks, but he had never imagined it would get this personal. Now, with his family in danger and his own life on the line, he had to make a choice. Would he keep pushing forward, no matter the cost? Or would he walk away while he still could? The answer for Marcus was clear. He had come too far to turn back now. But as he prepared to take the next step, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking into a trap. The circle was powerful, and they weren't going down without a fight. Marcus knew that the next few days would be critical. One wrong move, and everything he had worked for could come crashing down. But he also knew that if he succeeded, it would be worth it. Not just for him, but for everyone who had ever been wronged by the system. The question was, would he make it out alive? Only time would tell. The anonymous threat had shaken Marcus, but it also lit a fire under him. He couldn't afford to waste any more time. The circle was clearly onto him, and if he didn't act fast, they'd bury the evidence. Or worse, bury him. He spent the next few days working around the clock, piecing together the fragments of information he had gathered. The encrypted messages, the suspicious financial transactions, the whispered conversations he'd overheard. It was all starting to form a clearer picture. But the more he uncovered, the more he realized how vast and well-organized the circle truly was. This wasn't just a few bad apples. It was an entire system built to protect itself at all costs. One of the most troubling discoveries was the involvement of a high-profile city councilman, Robert Hargrove. On the surface, Hargrove was a respected public servant, known for his charismatic speeches and community outreach programs. But behind closed doors, he was one of the circle's key players. Marcus had managed to trace a series of payments from Hargrove's campaign funds to Judge Hayes's personal accounts. It wasn't just about money changing hands. It was about influence. Hargrove had been using his position to sway court decisions in favor of his allies, ensuring that anyone who crossed him or his friends would face the full force of the law. And Judge Hayes had been his enforcer. Marcus knew that exposing Hargrove would be a massive blow to the Circle, but it would also be incredibly dangerous. Hargrove had connections everywhere: politicians, law enforcement, even the media. Taking him down would be like poking a hornet's nest. While Marcus was focused on Hargrove, another angle of the investigation was unfolding, one that hit closer to home. Marcus's younger brother, Jamal, had been arrested on drug charges just a week after Judge Hayes' arrest. At first, Marcus thought it was a coincidence. Jamal had always been a bit of a wild card, and run-ins with the law weren't entirely out of character for him. But when Marcus looked into the details of the case, something didn't add up. The evidence against Jamal was flimsy at best, and the arresting officer had a history of targeting young black men in the neighborhood. Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that Jamal's arrest was a message, a warning to back off or face the consequences. It was a low blow, even for the Circle, and it made Marcus even more determined to bring them down. But it also put him in a difficult position. How could he protect his brother without compromising the investigation? Meanwhile, Judge Hayes was making moves of her own. From her jail cell, she had managed to rally her supporters, painting herself as the victim of a witch hunt. She had hired a high-powered defense attorney who was already working to discredit Marcus and the evidence he had gathered. The media, always hungry for a scandal, was eating it up. Headlines like, "Judge Hayes claims set up by rogue agent," were everywhere, and public opinion was starting to shift. Marcus knew he had to stay ahead of the narrative, but it wasn't easy. Every time he thought he had a solid lead, something would happen to throw him off track. A key witness would suddenly go silent. A piece of evidence would mysteriously disappear. It was like playing a game of chess against an opponent who always seemed to be one step ahead. The pressure was taking its toll on Marcus, both mentally and physically. He was barely sleeping, surviving on coffee and adrenaline. His wife, Lisa, had started to notice the changes in him, the dark circles under his eyes, the way he jumped at every little noise. She tried to talk to him, to convince him to take a step back, but Marcus wouldn't listen. "I can't stop now," he told her one night, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "If I do, they win, and I can't let that happen." Lisa didn't argue, but the worry in her eyes was unmistakable. She knew her husband was a fighter, but she also knew that even the strongest people had their limits. As the investigation deepened, Marcus began to uncover something even more disturbing. A pattern of cases that had been deliberately mishandled or dismissed, all involving people of color. It wasn't just about money or power. It was about control. The Circle had been systematically targeting marginalized communities, ensuring that they remained disenfranchised and powerless. Marcus felt a surge of anger as he read through the deals. These weren't just names on paper. They were real people whose lives had been destroyed by a system that was supposed to protect them. It only strengthened his resolve to see this through, no matter the cost. But the closer Marcus got to the truth, the more dangerous it became. One night, as he was leaving his office, he noticed a car parked across the street with its headlights off. At first, he thought nothing of it, but when he started walking to his car, the headlights flicked on and the engine roared to life. Marcus's instincts kicked in, and he ducked behind a dumpster just as the car sped past, tires screeching. His heart was pounding as he peered around the corner, but the car was already gone. He didn't know if it was a warning or an attempt on his life, but it was a stark reminder of what he was up against. The next morning, Marcus received another anonymous tip, this time in the form of a USB drive left on his doorstep. When he plugged it into his computer, he found a folder filled with documents, photos, and audio recordings. It was a treasure trove of evidence, but it also raised more questions than answers. Who had sent it? And why? The files pointed to even more members of the Circle, including a prominent defense attorney and a retired police captain. But there was also a note, written in the same bold letters as the previous threat. "You're playing with fire. Be careful who you trust, Arkusani." Didn't know what to make of it. Was the sender trying to help him or set him up? The line between ally and enemy was becoming increasingly blurred, and Marcus wasn't sure who he could trust. Even within his own team, there were whispers of leaks and double agents. The Circle's reach was everywhere, and Marcus was starting to feel like he was fighting a losing battle. But he couldn't give up, not now, not when he was so close. As he sat in his office, staring at the files on his computer, Marcus's mind raced. He knew he had to make a move, but every option came with risks. If he went public with the evidence, the Circle would retaliate. If he kept digging, he might not live to see the end of it, and if he walked away, the corruption would continue unchecked. It was a no-win situation, but Marcus had never been one to back down from a challenge. He just had to figure out his next move, and fast. Because one thing was clear, the Circle wasn't going to wait for him to make the first move. They were already planning theirs. And when they struck, Marcus knew it would be with everything they had. The USB drive had changed everything. The files it contained were explosive. Detailed records of bribes, secret meetings, and even a list of names that Marcus suspected were key members of the Circle. But as he sifted through the evidence, a chilling realization settled over him. Someone on the inside was feeding him this information. Someone who knew the risks but was willing to take them. The question was, who and why now? Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that this was a trap, but he also knew he couldn't ignore it. The stakes were too high. He had to act. And he had to act fast. The first name on the list was a shock. Detective Carl Ramirez, a veteran officer who had been with the department for over 20 years. Ramirez was well-liked and respected, the kind of cop who always seemed to be on the right side of the law, but according to the files, he had been working with the Circle for years, helping to cover up their crimes and silence anyone who got too close. Marcus felt a pang of betrayal. He had worked with Ramirez on a few cases, and he had always trusted him. Now, he wasn't sure who he could trust. If someone like Ramirez was involved, how deep did this go? Marcus decided to confront Ramirez, but he knew he had to be careful. He arranged a meeting under the guise of discussing a routine case, choosing a quiet diner on the outskirts of town. When Ramirez walked in, he looked as calm and collected as ever, but Marcus could see the tension in his eyes. They exchanged small talk for a few minutes, but Marcus could tell Ramirez was on edge. Finally, Marcus leaned in and lowered his voice. "I know about the Circle," he said. Ramirez froze, his coffee cup halfway to his lips. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Ramirez set the cup down and sighed. "I was wondering when you'd figure it out," he said. "But you're in over your head, Marcus. You don't know what you're dealing with." The conversation that followed was tense, to say the least. Ramirez admitted that he had been working with the Circle, but he claimed it was under duress. They had something on him, something big, and they had threatened to destroy his career and his family if he didn't cooperate. But now he was tired of living in fear. He wanted out, and he was willing to help Marcus bring them down. Marcus didn't know whether to believe him, but he didn't have much of a choice. He needed Ramirez's inside knowledge if he was going to take down the Circle, but he also knew that trusting the wrong person could get him killed. As the days passed, the pressure mounted. Marcus and Ramirez began working together in secret, piecing together the evidence they would need to expose the Circle. But it wasn't easy. Every move they made seemed to be anticipated, as if someone was always one step ahead. Marcus started to suspect that there was a mole within his own team, feeding information to the Circle. But who? He couldn't afford to make accusations without proof, so he kept his suspicions to himself, watching and waiting for a slip-up. Meanwhile, the threats against Marcus and his family were escalating. One night, he came home to find his front door slightly ajar. His heart raced as he pushed it open, gun drawn, but the house was empty. At least, it seemed that way. As he walked through the living room, He noticed something on the coffee table, a single playing card, the ace of spades. It was a message, clear and unmistakable. The circle was letting him know they could get to him any time, anywhere. Marcus felt a surge of anger, but also fear. He had always known this job was dangerous, but now it was personal. They were coming, after his family, and he couldn't let that stand. The breaking point came when Marcus received a call from Lisa. She was crying, her voice shaking as she told him that their kids had been followed home from school by a strange car. Marcus's blood ran cold. He had always tried to shield his family from the dangers of his work, but now they were being dragged into it. He knew he had to do something. But what? If he went to the police, he risked tipping off the circle. If he didn't, his family would remain in danger. It was a lose-lose situation, and Marcus felt the weight of it pressing down on him. That night, Marcus made a decision. He couldn't wait any longer. He had to take the evidence he had gathered and go public, even if it meant putting himself in the crosshairs. He arranged a meeting with a trusted journalist, someone he knew, wouldn't back down in the face of pressure. They met in a secluded park under the cover of darkness. Marcus handed over the files, his hands trembling slightly. "This is everything," he said. "But once this goes public, there's no turning back." The journalist nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. "We'll run the story tomorrow," they said. "But you need to be careful. If they find out it was you..." Marcus didn't need to hear the rest. He knew the risks, but he also knew he had no other choice. As he walked away from the meeting, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The streets were eerily quiet, the only sound the distant hum of traffic. He kept his hand on his gun, his eyes scanning the shadows. But he never saw the car until it was too late. The headlights blinded him as the car screeched to a halt just a few feet away. Marcus drew his gun, but before he could react, the doors flew open and 3 men in masks jumped out. They moved fast, too fast. Marcus managed to get off one shot before they were on him, tackling him to the ground. He fought back with everything he had, but he was outnumbered. The last thing he remembered was a sharp pain in the back of his head, and then everything went black. When Marcus woke up, he was in a dark, unfamiliar room. His hands were tied, and his head was pounding. He tried to move, but the ropes were too tight. Panic set in as he realized where he was, and who had taken him. The door creaked open and a figure stepped into the room. Marcus squinted, trying to make out their face in the dim light. When he finally saw who it was, his heart sank. It was someone he had trusted, someone he had never suspected, and now they were standing over him with a cold, calculating smile. "You should have stayed out of this, Marcus," the figure said. "But don't worry, we'll take good care of your family once we're done with you." Marcus's mind raced as he tried to process what was happening. He had been so close to exposing the circle, but now he was at their mercy. And his family. What would happen to them? He couldn't let them suffer because of his choices. But, as he sat there, bound and helpless, he realized something. He wasn't out of options yet. The evidence was still out there, and the journalist would run the story tomorrow. If he could just hold on a little longer, there was still a chance. But first, he had to find a way out of this room. And with every passing second, that was becoming less and less likely. The figure leaned in closer, their voice low and menacing. "You thought you could take us down? You're just one man, Marcus, and now you're nothing." Marcus clenched his fists, his mind racing. He had come too far to give up now. But as he looked into the eyes of the person standing over him, he knew one thing for sure. This wasn't over. Not yet. And if he had anything to say about it, it wouldn't end the way they wanted. The question was, could he survive long enough? To make that happen, only time would tell. The room was cold, the air thick with tension as Marcus stared up at the figure standing over him. His mind raced, trying to piece together how everything had gone so wrong so quickly. He had trusted this person, relied on them, and now they were the ones holding all the cards. But just as the figure began to speak again, the door behind them burst open, and another person stepped into the room. Marcus's eyes widened in shock. It was Lisa, his wife. She wasn't supposed to be here. She wasn't even supposed to know about any of this. Marcus had kept her in the dark to protect her, to keep her safe. But now, here she was, standing in the doorway, with a look of determination on her face that Marcus had never seen before. "Let him go," she said, her voice steady but firm. The figure turned to her, clearly caught off guard. "Lisa," Marcus croaked, his voice hoarse. "What are you doing here?" She didn't answer him. Instead, she took a step forward, her eyes locked on the figure. I said, "Let him go." For a moment, no one moved. Then the figure laughed, a cold, humorless sound that sent a chill down Marcus's spine. "You think you can just walk in here and make demands," they said. "You have no idea what you're dealing with." Lisa didn't flinch. "Oh, I think I do," she said. And then she did something Marcus never expected. She reached into her bag and pulled out a gun, aiming it straight at the figure. Marcus's heart pounded. Since when did Lisa know how to handle a gun? Since when did she have the guts to walk into a situation like this? He had always seen her as the calm, steady force in his life, the one who kept their family grounded. But now, she was someone else entirely. Someone fearless. Someone dangerous. The figure hesitated, clearly unsure of what to do. Lisa took another step forward, her finger tightening on the trigger. "I'm not leaving without him," she said. "And if you try to stop me, you'll regret it." The figure glanced at Marcus, then back at Lisa, weighing their options. Finally, they stepped aside, their hands raised in mock surrender. "Fine," they said. "Take him. But this isn't over. You've just made things a lot worse for yourselves." Lisa didn't respond. She kept the gun trained on the figure. As she moved to untie Marcus, her hands steady despite the tension in the room. As soon as Marcus was free, he grabbed Lisa's arm and pulled her toward the door. "We need to go," he said, his voice urgent. "Now." They ran out of the room and into the night, the sound of their footsteps echoing in the empty streets. Marcus's mind was spinning. How had Lisa found him? And why had she risked everything? To come after him? He didn't have time to ask questions. They needed to get somewhere safe, somewhere the circle couldn't reach them. But as they turned a corner, Marcus realized they weren't alone. A car was following them, its headlights cutting through the darkness. Marcus's heart sank. They weren't going to make it. Lisa grabbed his hand and pulled him into an alley, her movements quick and decisive. "This way," she said, leading him through a maze of narrow streets and back alleys. Marcus followed, his mind still reeling. Who was this woman he thought he knew so well? And what else had she been keeping from him? They finally reached a small, unmarked door, and Lisa pushed it open, pulling Marcus inside. The room was dimly lit, but Marcus could see that it was some kind of safe house, a place Lisa clearly knew well. "What is this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Lisa turned to him, her expression serious. "It's a long story," she said, "but right now we need to focus on staying alive." Marcus wanted to press her for answers, but he knew she was right. The circle was still out there, and they weren't going to stop until they got what they wanted. Marcus and Lisa were running out of time, and they both knew it. But as they huddled together in the safe house, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story than he realized. Lisa had secrets, secrets that could change everything. And if they were going to survive this, he needed to know what they were. Outside, the sound of engines revved and tires screeched. The circle was closing in, and Marcus and Lisa were trapped. But as Marcus looked at his wife, he saw something in her eyes that gave him hope. She wasn't just the woman he had married, she was a fighter, and if they were going to make it out of this alive, they would have to fight together. The question was, would it be enough? The circle was powerful, ruthless, and they had already proven that they would stop at nothing to protect their secrets. Marcus and Lisa were about to face their biggest challenge yet, and this time, there was no room for error. As the sound of footsteps grew louder outside the door, Marcus tightened his grip on the gun Lisa had handed him. He didn't know what was coming next, but he knew one thing for sure. This wasn't over. Not yet. And if they were going to make it out of this alive, They would have to be smarter, faster, and stronger than ever before. The stakes had never been higher, and the clock was ticking. But Marcus wasn't ready to give up, not now, not ever. The footsteps outside the door grew louder, each one echoing like a drum beat in Marcus's ears. He glanced at Lisa, who was crouched beside him, her face a mask of determination. She gave him a small nod, and he knew they were in this together, no matter what. The door handle rattled, and Marcus tightened his grip on the gun, his heart pounding. This was it. The moment they had been fighting for or running from was here. The door burst open and two men in masks stormed in, guns drawn. Marcus didn't hesitate. He fired, hitting the first man in the shoulder and sending him stumbling back. The second man ducked behind the door frame, returning fire. Bullets ricocheted off the walls and Marcus and Lisa dove for cover behind an overturned table. The room was chaos. Shouts, gunfire, the sound of glass shattering. Marcus's mind raced. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and running out of options. But then Lisa did something that changed everything. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small device, pressing a button on the side. A deafening alarm blared through the room, and the lights flickered before going out completely. The sudden darkness threw the attackers off balance, and Marcus seized the moment. He lunged forward, tackling one of the men to the ground and disarming him. Lisa was right behind him, using the chaos to her advantage. She moved like someone who had been trained for this, her movements precise and calculated. Marcus didn't have time to process what was happening. He just knew they had to survive. When the lights came back on, the room was silent. The attackers were down, either unconscious or too injured to move. Marcus and Lisa stood in the middle of the room, breathing heavily, their eyes locked. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Marcus broke the silence. "Lisa," he said, his voice shaking. "What the hell is going on? How do you know how to do all this?" She hesitated, then sighed. "I wasn't completely honest with you," she said. "Before we met, I worked for a federal task force. I was undercover just like you. But I left that life behind when we started a family. I thought it was over. But when I realized what you were up against, I knew I had to step in." Marcus stared at her, stunned. All this time he had been trying to protect her, to keep her out of danger. And now he was learning that she had been in this world long. Before he had, it was a lot to take in. But there was no time to dwell on it. The sound of sirens outside snapped them back to reality. The police were coming, and they needed to get out of there before the circle's connections within the department showed. They ran out of the building and into the night, the sirens growing louder behind them. Marcus's mind was racing. They had survived the attack, but the circle was still out there, and they weren't going to stop until Marcus and Lisa were silenced for good. They needed a plan, and they needed it fast. As they turned a corner, Marcus spotted a familiar face, Detective Ramirez. He was standing by a car, his expression grim. Marcus's first instinct was to run, but Ramirez held up his hands. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said. "I'm here to help. I've got proof, everything you need to take down the circle. But we have to move now." Marcus hesitated. He didn't know if he could trust Ramirez, but he didn't have much of a choice. They were running out of time. He nodded, and Ramirez opened the car door. "Get in," he said. "We've got one shot at this." Marcus and Lisa climbed into the car, and Ramirez sped off, weaving through the streets with practiced ease. As they drove, Ramirez explained that he had been working undercover within the circle, gathering evidence to bring them down from the inside. He had been waiting for the right moment to make his move, and that moment was now. They arrived at a nondescript building on the outskirts of town. Ramirez led them inside, where a team of federal agents was waiting. Marcus recognized a few of them from his own task force. They had been working on the case in secret, coordinating with Ramirez to take down the circle once and for all. The evidence they had gathered was overwhelming. Financial records, audio recordings, even video footage of key members discussing their crimes. It was enough to bring down not just Judge Hayes and Councilman Hargrove, but the entire network of corruption they had built. But just as they were preparing to make their move, Marcus's phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. "You think you've won. But the game isn't over yet. Marcus's blood ran cold. He showed Diu the message to Lisa and Ramirez, and they exchanged worried glances. The circle had eyes everywhere, and they weren't going down without a fight. The team moved quickly, coordinating with federal authorities to execute a series of raids on the circle's key locations. Judge Hayes, Councilman Hargrove, and several other high-profile members were arrested, their crimes exposed to the public. The media went wild, and the city erupted in outrage. It was a victory, but Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that something was still off. That text message haunted him. Who had sent it? And what did they mean by, "The game isn't over yet"? The answer came sooner than he expected. As Marcus and Lisa were leaving the federal building, a car pulled up beside them. The window rolled down, and Marcus froze. It was someone he had never expected to see, someone he thought was long gone. It was his old mentor, Agent Daniels, the man who had recruited him into the task force all those years ago. Daniels had disappeared years ago, presumed dead, but here he was, alive and well, with a cold smile on his face. "You did good, Marcus," he said. "But you didn't think it would be that easy, did you?" Marcus's mind raced. What was Daniels doing here, and why did he look so pleased? Before Marcus could react, Daniels handed him a file. "Take a look," he said. "You'll want to see this." Marcus opened the file, and his heart sank. It was a list of names, high-ranking officials, law enforcement officers, even a few judges. All of them were connected to the circle, but not in the way Marcus had thought. They weren't just members. They were pawns. The real mastermind was someone else entirely, someone who had been pulling the strings from the shadows all along. Marcus looked up at Daniels, his voice barely above a whisper. "Who is it?" Daniels smiled again, but there was no warmth in it. "You'll find out soon enough," he said. "But for now, just know this. The circle was just the beginning. The real game is just getting started." And with that, he rolled up the window and drove off, leaving Marcus and Lisa standing on the sidewalk, stunned and speechless. The fight wasn't over, not even close. But as Marcus looked at Lisa, he knew one thing for sure. They were in this together. And no matter what came next, they would face it head on. The circle might have been dismantled, but the shadows still held secrets, secrets that could change everything. And Marcus wasn't about to stop until he uncovered the truth, no matter the cost. Marcus stood on the sidewalk, the weight of Daniels's words pressing down on him like a storm cloud. The file in his hands felt heavy, not just with the names it contained, but with the realization that everything he had fought for, everything he had risked, was only the tip of the iceberg. Lisa stood beside him, her hand gripping his arm tightly, as if she could sense the turmoil raging inside him. "What now?" she asked, her voice steady but laced with concern. Marcus took a deep breath, his mind racing. He didn't have all the answers, but he knew one thing for sure. They couldn't stop now. Not when there was still so much at stake. They spent the next few days going through the file Daniels had given them, cross-referencing names, dates, and locations. It was painstaking work, but slowly a pattern began to emerge. The names on the list weren't just random officials. They were part of a larger network, one that stretched far beyond the city limits. This wasn't just about corruption in the justice system anymore. It was about something much bigger, something that had been operating in the shadows for years, maybe even decades. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine as he realized the scope of what they were dealing with. This wasn't just a fight for justice. It was a fight for the soul of the system itself. Lisa was the one who suggested they reach out to Ramirez again. Despite everything, he had proven himself to be an ally, and they needed all the help they could get. Ramirez agreed to meet them at a secluded park, far from prying eyes. When he arrived, he looked just as tense as they felt. "I've been digging into this too," he said, handing Marcus a flash drive. "There's more, a lot more." The flash drive contained encrypted files, but with Lisa's help, they were able to crack the code. What they found was staggering. evidence of a global network of corruption, with ties to politicians, corporations, and even foreign governments. It was a web so vast and intricate that it seemed impossible to untangle. But Marcus knew they had to try. The next few weeks were a blur of meetings, late-night research, and tense conversations. Marcus and Lisa worked tirelessly, coordinating with federal agents, journalists, and even a few whistleblowers who had been too afraid to come forward before. It was risky, and they knew it. Every move they made could be their last. But they also knew they couldn't do this alone. They needed allies, people who were willing to stand up and fight for what was right, no matter the cost. One of those allies turned out to be Marcus's brother, Jamal. After his arrest, Jamal had been released on bail, thanks to Marcus's connections. But instead of laying low, Jamal had decided to join the fight. "I'm tired of running," he told Marcus one night. "I want to do something that matters." Marcus was hesitant at first. He didn't want to put his brother in danger, but he also knew that Jamal had a unique perspective and skills that could be invaluable. Together, they began to piece together the final pieces of the puzzle. Uncovering, a name that sent shockwaves through the team: Senator Eleanor Grayson. Grayson was a rising star in the political world, known for her charisma and progressive policies. But behind the polished image was a woman who had been pulling the strings of the circle for years, using her influence to protect the network and expand its reach. She was the mastermind, the one who had been orchestrating everything from the shadows. And now, thanks to Marcus and his team, they had the evidence to prove it. The final showdown came at a press conference Grayson was holding to announce her bid for higher office. Marcus, Lisa, Ramirez, and Jamal were there, blending into the crowd as they waited for the right moment. When Grayson took the stage, she was as confident as ever, her smile dazzling the cameras. But as she began her speech, Marcus stepped forward, holding up a copy of the evidence they had gathered. "Senator Grayson," he said, his voice ringing out across the room, "we have some questions for you." The room erupted in chaos as journalists scrambled to get the story. Grayson tried to maintain her composure, but the evidence was undeniable. Financial records, audio recordings, even photos of her meeting with known members of the circle. Within hours, the story was everywhere, and Grayson's carefully constructed image began to crumble. By the end of the day, she had resigned from her position, and federal agents were moving in to arrest her. It was a victory, but it came at a cost. Marcus knew that the fight wasn't over, not completely. There were still others out there, still shadows that needed to be brought into the light. But for now, they had done what they set out to do. They had exposed the truth. In the weeks that followed, the fallout from Grayson's arrest was immense. Dozens of officials were implicated, and the public outcry led to sweeping reforms in the justice system. Marcus and Lisa became symbols of hope, proof that even in the face of overwhelming odds, it was possible to make a difference. But for Marcus, the real victory was knowing that he had stood up for what was right, no matter the cost. He had faced his fears, confronted his doubts, and come out stronger on the other side. As for Lisa, she had proven herself to be more than just a partner. She was a fighter, a survivor, and the one person Marcus knew he could always count on. Together, they had faced the darkness and come out the other side, stronger and more united than ever. And as they stood together, watching the sun rise over the city they had fought so hard to protect, Marcus knew that no matter what came next, they would face it together. Because in the end, that was what mattered most. Not the battles they had won, but the people they had fought for. And as long as they had each other, they could face anything. The story of Marcus and Lisa wasn't just about corruption or justice. It was about the power of perseverance, the importance of standing up for what's right, and the strength that comes from fighting for the people you love. It was a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there is always hope, and that sometimes the greatest victories come from the hardest fights. And as the city began to heal, Marcus and Lisa knew that their work was far from over, but they also knew that as long as they had each other, they could face whatever came next. Together,